Good morning, everybody, and hello. Good morning, Speaker. Good morning, Minister of Women, Youth, Children and Family Affairs, all in the right order, I hope. Big portfolio. Azusa, Country Manager here for UNDP. Many distinguished women leaders present from Solomon Islands and from the region. Lovely to be back in the Solomon Islands. Feel the warmth. I've come from the New Zealand winter, so very nice to have some heat. But also nice to be here for such an important occasion, because I know that you are anticipating that there will be elections in the early months of next year. And as the Minister said, last time 26 women stood and one was elected. We don't want that to happen again, do we? No. We don't want to go backwards, do we? We want to go forward. And of course, part of going forward is the very encouraging result of that relatively recent by-election where a woman was elected. So we should take this as a very, very positive sign. So, we come together in this workshop, and I thank everyone who's played a part in bringing it together. That these things don't happen easily. There's a lot of work, a lot of thinking, a lot of liaising, a lot of bringing the development partners together around the concept, but here we are. And we're here because we want to see more women, voting, engaging, running and being elected. So these are the objectives. Now, obviously, the start is from quite a low base. If we look at the provincial assemblies, currently 4 women members and the 2 women MPs. But my key messages, and I'm going to start with them and I'll finish with them, are this can change. That's the first thing. It can change. And secondly, it must change. Because as I said last night, we can't talk about achieving sustainable development goals without gender equality. Because what is one of the core principles of that sustainable development goal agenda? Leave no one behind. So if you leave women behind, whether it's in economic empowerment or education or health or whatever it is, then you're not going to reach the sustainable development goals. So we should see leaving no one behind as meaning women have to be fully part of the story. So let me put these messages first in a global context, because gender inequality of course holds women back, but actually it holds their whole countries back, holds our world back. You know, there was an estimate done of what the global impact of gender inequality in the world of work and the economy is. McKinsey's and UN Women. Well, you know, we're talking trillions, right, of lost GDP. I often think if talking about rights doesn't impress people, let's talk about money. It costs countries not to have gender equality. I was in Africa in August 2016 for the launch of the Africa Human Development Report, and it was on the gender gap in Africa and what was it costing Africa. And the cost was estimated at $95 billion a year for sub-Saharan Africa. So I showed this very dramatic graph of the loss to the President of Kenya, who was with me at the launch, and I said, look at this. This is what the continent's losing every year. He said, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? We've got to fix it. We've got to fix it. Now, what would it be if we did that figure for Solomon Islands? If the women were paid as much, employed as much, and so on? What would it be if we did it for the South Pacific? Of course, everyone would be better off. So then we come to, if everyone would be better off, what stops it happening? Well, quite a lot of laws, policies and practices which don't treat women equally stop it happening. Now, each year the World Bank does a Women, Business and the Law report. And they found in the latest one I've seen, which was 2016, that still around the world, There are 155 countries which have at least one law which discriminates against women. There are 100 countries which formally restrict the kind of work that women can do. And women in 18 countries cannot get a job without their husband's permission. Then, in the research being put together for the 2017 report, the bank found, and this is a very interesting concept, 1.4 billion women in the world lack legal protection against what they call domestic economic violence. And they define that as controlling a woman's ability to access economic resources as a form of intimidation and coercion. And more than 1 billion women lack protection against domestic sexual violence. So, we take all these things together, they do amount to quite significant barriers. And these barriers exist here, some of them, in Solomon Islands. I understand women are only around 1 in 3 in the paid workforce. Women are doing over half of the unpaid work. Around the world, women do 3/4 of all the unpaid work. There is a gender gap in wage income in Solomon Islands. It's around 18%. But the wage gap in the private sector, I understand, is about 37%. There's more women than men in what the International Labour Organisation calls vulnerable employment. 75% of women are considered in vulnerable employment here, 54% of men. And some women don't have autonomy over their income, even when they are the breadwinner. That probably meets that definition of domestic economic violence that the World Bank has developed. Now, at the global level, the World Economic Forum, which does this report every year on the global gender gap, estimates it will take 217 years on current trends to achieve gender equality in the workplace. Unthinkable. Unthinkable. And as I say, this is not just holding women back, it's holding everybody back. It holds the family back, the community back, the whole country. So what will make a difference? Well, the reasons that bring you here today is what will help make a difference. Because for economic empowerment and all the other issues that women would like to see prioritised to really come centre stage, you do need women's political empowerment. And you need a critical mass of women in decision making. It's quite lonely being the only woman minister in a cabinet. Quite lonely being 2 women MPs in a parliament. So a critical mass which can make the issues that women want to see addressed priorities is very important, and the men will start listening more with a critical mass. Now, I do know what it's like to be one of quite a small number of women. When I went into New Zealand Parliament in 1981, and I'll say a little bit more about that, we were 8 women out of 92. That was under 9%. Very, very low number indeed. The global average today for women in parliaments is around 23%. But where the numbers start to lift, you do see much more response to women's priorities. And this is true at the most basic level of government right through to the top. So in India, quite a number of years ago now, they legislated for a quota for women at the local council level. I understand there's some debate here in Solomons as to what the form of the most local level of government should be. Many countries have, municipalities, but even below that, a community board. So in India, at that kind of community board level, 30% of those on the boards have to be women. And there was a change noticed and studied when this got traction with the 30%, because the women started to prioritise things that really affected them, like water. Who walks for the water? Women. Women want water in the village. They don't want to have to walk an hour or two or more for it, which gets worse with climate change, I might say, and water stress. So it demonstrably made a difference. But you can look at other countries where the women have really got to quite significant numbers, like Rwanda. And think of Rwanda. You know, Solomon Islands knew its terrible years of civil conflict. Terrible years. Rwanda had a genocide with 1 million people killed in quite a small country. And they had to rebuild their country from ruins. And so many people had lost their family members and split communities. So one of the things they did was prioritise women's representation, and they do have quotas. They have the highest proportion of women's representation in the world now, over 60% in the lower house of parliament in Rwanda, with their Fresh Start. And by Joves, they do things for women. The issues they address, it's really so far-sighted. So, you know, another example often talked about is Costa Rica. When the women began to become much more prominent, they started picking up issues like the issues for the single parent. Single parent in a lot of societies can be very discriminated against. In my country, up until the early 70s, there was no support for the single parent, and the single parent was under a lot of pressure to give her child away for adoption. And then in the early 70s, when the single parents' payment came, they were able to exercise their right to keep their children for the first time. So, you know, these kinds of issues get picked up. New Zealand now, and I'll come back to our story a bit later, but it's interesting what starts to get addressed with women in significant places. I could name a lot of things that I'm very proud of from my time in those positions, but just one that's happened recently. New Zealand has become the first country in the world to pass a law which says that a woman who is fleeing from a violent home is entitled to 10 days paid leave to get her and her family re-established. It might be in a shelter, who knows, but 10 days paid leave. So, you know, often for women who want to leave a violent situation, it's the economics that stops them. They think, what am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this? How do I get my family out of this? So this is regarded as really world-leading legislation. Sort of thing you can do when you get almost 40% of the parliament as female. So the simple message from all this is that you're much more likely to get the issues important to women addressed with significant numbers of women members of parliament. And as for the issues that Solomon's women would want addressed, well, that's for all of you to say, not for me. But I know women are always very concerned about education. And you know that in this country still quite a lot of boys and girls don't finish their primary schooling. A lot don't get on to secondary schooling or further education and training. I would expect women to put a big emphasis on these kinds of issues, on health services. And here we're talking about access to the basic services. And I see there's been a lot of improvements. The number of women who are now seeing a trained birth attendant at the time of birth, for example, has really improved a great deal. But one of the huge challenges in the Pacific, probably the greatest health challenge in a way, and it is getting worse, is what we call the non-communicable diseases. So yes, there's tobacco and there's alcohol, and we know about that, but I think the full impact now of the poor nutrition with so-called modern foods that are full of processed sugars, fats and salts is taking its toll with the level of obesity, type 2 diabetes, kidney failure, amputations, all the consequences that we know about. And I think women are going to play a leading role in addressing that crisis, because women in the end will have a lot of say over what the family is eating. You know, I remember years ago going to the Tokelau Islands, and on the atoll of Nokanunu, I sat with the ladies and they said, we're seeing so much illness here we never saw before, like this diabetes. What is happening? I said, it's your diet. I said, there was a time when life in Tokelau was very simple, with fishing, coconut. Actually quite difficult even to grow vegetables in Tokelau because they're such poor soil. But I said then along came a different era. What's in the shop? Sugar, white flour, corned beef, which is full of fat. You know, the diet's changed and people probably aren't as active. So I think women, and my message to those women was you're going to have a big part in trying to turn this around. And I think strong leadership from women in decision-making positions here and then wherever else women are is going to be vital. Access to sexual and reproductive health services. You know, in so many developing countries, and I'm sure Solomon Islands would not be alone in this, there is unmet need for family planning services. And often a concern about teen pregnancy, because early pregnancy is again often quite a barrier to finishing education and having autonomy and say over your life. Obviously the high rates of domestic violence would be something the women as legislators would be very keen to address. Issues of housing, water and sanitation I've mentioned, and then also climate change. And believe me, we have seen nothing yet. Even if the whole Paris Agreement with its vision for turning the tide on global warming was to be realised, we still face decades of the weather getting worse, more extreme, before it stabilises. If people keep their word, and at the moment we don't look like we're going to achieve the Paris Agreement. So for the island nations, this is a terrible threat, with more and more severe storms, the salt water coming into the traditional water supply, the crops not resistant to this change. You know, over time crops adjust, but they need, of their own accord, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, not decades. So there's a lot of adaptation and adjustment to do. But with the extreme weather events around the world, what we see is that women are the most vulnerable, because you have a tidal wave, tsunami, a mega storm. The death rates for women are higher. They can be as high as 3 to 1 for men. And the reason appears to be that often when these events happen, and you don't get a lot of notice, the women are looking after the children, maybe an elderly relative, maybe a relative with disabilities. They can't leave. They're kind of trapped with others who are vulnerable. So climate change makes women more vulnerable. And I think, you know, climate change adaptation strategies absolutely need women's involvement. And again, I'd expect to see women MPs, you know, very, very active on those issues. So, how are we going to get more women sitting around these decision-making tables in the National Parliament and in the provincial assemblies, and maybe one day in more local government as well? I know there's a council here in Honiara, but below that it's not so systematised or institutionalised as I understand it. On the global trends, again, the World Economic Forum, looking at the trends of women coming into parliaments, well, they say it's far too slow. On current trends, it would take 99 years to get gender parity around the world in parliaments. I don't think you want to wait 99 years in the Solomon Islands, because none of us would be here to see it, so we don't want to wait that long. But it can be done. And let me just put it in a little perspective from the New Zealand example. So this year, New Zealand is celebrating 125 years of women having the right to vote. 125 years, first in the world. Voted on by an all-male parliament. You need male allies to get these things done. And when you think about it, 1893, how incredible it was that happened in New Zealand. But it was another 26 years until women were given the right to stand as candidates. And from the time of 1893, it was 40 years till a woman was elected. So you can say that from the coming of independence in Solomon Islands, 1978, At least it didn't take 40 years to get the first woman, right? It didn't take that long. We were slow. And then we got our first woman cabinet minister in 1947. That's a while ago. But we didn't get the second until the 1960s. We got the third in 1972. The fourth and fifth in 1984. And I must have been the sixth in 1987. I mean, this is pathetic, really. 1893 to 1987, and you're still only the sixth. Ridiculous. Now, prior to 1981, when I was elected, the greatest number of women in a parliament in New Zealand was 4. 4! And there'd only ever been 8 women elected in all the history of New Zealand. In Auckland, where I was an MP, I was only the second ever elected. And the first one was elected in a by-election in 1941 and defeated in 1943. 2 years. Pathetic. And I have to say, while the numbers doubled in 1981 from 4 to 8, and I can still name each of those women today because there's so few of us, there were very few expectations of us. My hope was maybe one day I could become a minister. Because as you can see, that was pretty rare. There'd only ever been 3. And no one ever thought of a minister as Prime Minister. In fact, really no one thought of a woman as Prime Minister till the 1990s, when I became Leader of the Opposition, and that was very tough. It looked like it could never happen. So if it looks bleak here sometimes, you're not alone. But it can change with very determined women. And sometimes something will trigger a change. So I became Leader of the Opposition. I didn't win the first election after that. But while the result wasn't that great, it was better than people thought it would be. And so a change of government began to look a little bit likely. And then, because the governing party wasn't doing very well, they thought, well, they'd change their leader and they'd put a woman in as leader to try and take me on. So we ended up with a woman Leader of the Opposition and a woman Prime Minister. That changed the dynamic, because both major parties had women leaders. And then I went on to win in 1999. Now, that was 18 years after becoming a Member of Parliament. And one of my other key messages is you need a lot of resilience for this. It doesn't happen fast. 18 years from the time of being an MP. Now our new PM, she did 9 years. She's not a novice. She got there at 37. I got there at 49 after 18 years, and that was thought to be young. We set new benchmarks now. But now for more than half the last 21 years, New Zealanders have had women Prime Ministers. And we used to hear the little stories about boys saying to their mother, do you think a boy could ever be Prime Minister in New Zealand? Well, sadly the answer is yes, but anyway. But of course our new Prime Minister is setting sort of new milestones. She's just had a baby and taken 6 weeks maternity leave. And people are very supportive of this. And her Minister of Women's Affairs just made the world headlines because her baby was very slow coming and has had to be induced. She got on her bicycle and rode to the hospital. She must be so strong. I just saw it reported on the BBC, so it's not just the New Zealand news. So strength and resilience. So here in the Solomons, women have a lot of strength and resilience, right? But in politics you also have some particular challenges. And I think Azusa summed it up when she was talking about the results of the survey, which show that really it's not culture that's holding women back. It's money, politics. Money, politics. these constituency development funds do give incumbents, the sitting MPs, an advantage. Of course, very few women sitting MPs. As the MPs have budgets to spend, and that might be hard to compete with, although always underline, your vote is secret. It is a secret ballot. So it's not just the CDFs, there's also that the campaign spending limits are not very well enforced. So while people should only spend X, there's a strong suspicion they spend Y. So that is an issue. But I think for women, and also for supportive men who are looking at the situation, the question to ask is, has this brought the development results the people of the Solomon Islands want and deserve? And if the answer is no, or not entirely, then are things at a tipping point where people might want a different sort of conversation about what the women and men who are prepared to speak against money politics could do. Maybe this could create openings. Maybe the recent by-election is one of those tipping points where a woman came through. But on creating openings, you know, those in this room are going to have to work to create them. And I often say that in politics for women, no one is going to roll out a red carpet for you. They're not going to open the door and say, please come in, we've been waiting for you. They're not going to say that. You're going to roll your own red carpet out. You've got to open the door yourself. In fact, you might have to kick it in. You might have to take it off its hinges to get in. And you can't do it on your own. You have to have networks, teams, family support, obviously important, but you can't do it all on your own. Now, I think it's very, very helpful that this research was supported by UNDP, Australian Aid, and the European Commission on women's leadership and political participation and attitudes towards it in the Solomon Islands. And I regard it actually as there's quite a lot of positives in this for this workshop to build on. Not culture. That's not the issue, in my opinion, and looking at the survey. Because when people were surveyed in Solomon Islands, they were really quite positive about women's leadership and the reasons that women put themselves forward for public office. For example, when they were asked, why do you think women stand and why do you think men stand? For women, it was overwhelmingly, oh, well, they're standing to do some good, in the different parts of that. Only 4% of people thought that women were standing for financial gain. 21% thought men were standing for financial gain. So women are being seen as really standing for the public good. And when they were polled, 74% said they would vote for a woman candidate. Now, the truth is very few of them ever have, but the intention is good. The survey tells us that to win, you need deep connections to the constituency. Now, this isn't unique to Solomon Islands. Wherever you run as a Member of Parliament anywhere in the world, you have to be able to connect to the constituency. And if you don't come from there, you better find some ways of connecting fast. When I ran in the Mount Albert electorate in Auckland, actually I'd never lived in Mount Albert. I'd lived elsewhere round about. But of course, I made the point that my father had been to the grammar school in Mount Albert, and I very quickly identified with the local organisations. I became a patron of the bowling clubs and the Returns Servicemen's Association and the Rugby League and all of these things. And all politics in the end is local, right up to and including my years as Prime Minister. Every weekend was going round those sports clubs, local associations, the different national days of the many different ethnic communities that made up the constituency. That was your weekend, and usually your Friday and your Monday in opposition as well. So local connection, very important. Money, and we'll come back to that. Obviously, you can't run without money. often family connections as well, and that's not unusual either, and a track record of service. People want to know, what have you done? Now, all of you here, you've done a lot. Make sure that CV is compelling, right? The biography is compelling. Set out what you've done at the most local level and moving on through. The survey told us that to be competitive, it's important to lay the groundwork early. Now here we are, we're mid-August. Election could be, late March, early April, whatever. So that means really for the time Parliament's dissolved, it's all on. So there's not a moment to lose, is there? Not a moment to lose. Building that strong support base, starting to mobilise the family, the community that know you, the organisations that know you, looking at how the resources can be brought together. And also the survey suggested that being perceived as having an agenda which is primarily women-focused, you have to be broader than that, because men and women you want to vote for you. Now the women will expect you to advance the issues on sort of things that are priorities, but you are a representative for the whole community. I was always very conscious of that. But once you're there, you're in a position to use your voice on the specific women's issues as well, and by all means, appeal to the women on that basis. I think of the first woman president elected in Africa, the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Actually, what carried her to power was she motivated the market women to vote. They call the ladies in the market women. They were swept along by Ellen and her vision of what she could do for them. And of course, knowing the constituency and the issues is important. I also want to underline how important it is to have a high level of self-belief, right? Because if you don't believe in yourself, how can you expect anybody else to? You have to know that you're ready for this. And as women, often, we're the last to think that we're ready. And the research shows that men who are about 60% ready will always step up and say they're ready. Women who are 120% ready will say, I'm not ready. Well, no, you're ready. The fact that you're here means you're ready, right? So believe it in yourself. Now, let's look at some of the other key findings. Pitch what you have to say as benefiting the whole country and the whole community, about a vision for the Solomons and development going forward. When women benefit, everyone will benefit. As I said, for the sustainable development goals to be achieved, women have to be a full part of that. Around the world we see, for example, where women have more education, firstly, their aspirations for their children are higher, to finish their schooling and go on and do things. In countries where the death of babies and small children is still a significant issue, each year of extra education a woman has improves the chances of her child surviving past the age of 5, which is a critical point. Women with education, and particularly able to complete education, you will see a delayed age of marriage and first pregnancy, which is also important for health and empowerment. So I think, very much put the case for women as one that's a benefit to everybody. Yes, of course it's a benefit to women, but it's a benefit to a whole country. About 6 years ago, on the sidelines of the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, I launched with our then head of gender at UNDP, who was a Ugandan woman, a guide to strengthening women's political participation. And it probably pretty much governs the approach that Azusa takes today, but it's a whole electoral cycle, right? As in that term, electoral cycle. And it divided the cycle for women's participation into 3 phases. The first selection, the second election, and the third post-election. Now, on selection, the political parties are extremely important. I know that the political party system is not as well developed in Solomons as in some places, but, you know, it's there, and it's probably going to develop further. Political parties can be the greatest champions or the greatest opponents of women's participation. So they have to be converted to being great champions. I've been down to see the Prime Minister this morning. He tells me his party wants to see more women. I say, take the Prime Minister at his word, more women. More women from the political parties on the tickets. And then, if we're talking about the election phase, the political parties have to take into account that the women start with less money. So there has to be some support for that. The parties have to rally support for their candidates who are women. And in some countries also, and I'm not sure to what extent that would be an issue here, but in some countries, women who are stepping up in politics, where there haven't been many women before, face real issues of physical security. And that's got to be looked after as well, because no one wants to be assaulted on the campaign trail. The former Prime Minister of Pakistan, who was opposition leader, was tragically killed campaigning. Obviously an extreme form of violence to be killed, but you know, it can be an issue. And then in the post-election phase, and you know, wouldn't it be wonderful to see a larger group of women come through, forming a women's caucus is quite important. A women's network across whatever party or faction or whatever, so that the women have some solidarity in numbers. UNDP has worked with those caucuses all around the world in parliaments. I mean, obviously there's some skills to be built, skills of communication, public speaking. Some of you I've been speaking to come from a teaching background, so you're used to speaking and communicating, but not everyone comes from that background. So those skills need to be built. There's skills around campaign strategy, definitely understanding the processes and the legal requirements. You know, it doesn't pay to get the nomination paper in late because that won't be accepted, but you know, whatever rules and regulations there are. If we look at the big picture, there are structural changes which help boost women's participation around the world. The first is the nature of the electoral system. Now, in New Zealand, the breakthrough for women came when we dropped the kind of electoral system you have here. First past the post. First past the post, I understand people can get elected in Solomons with a very, very small proportion of the vote. But it happens to be the biggest pile of votes. It might only be 11%, but it's the biggest pile. Well, the Australians have the preferential voting, which at least sees that it goes until somebody gets over 50%, which probably would give women a better chance. For New Zealand, it was bringing in proportional representation, which kept electorates, but also had list members. And then when the parties had to front up with lists, the women start looking at these lists, they think, where are the women? Why should I vote for you? You haven't got women on your list, or they're too low down. So that becomes quite a transparent process. So people, women do get elected in bigger numbers under that kind of system. So this is not something you're going to change in Solomons in the next 3-6 months, but it's something to think about, that the nature of the electoral system has an impact on the representation not only of women, but of diverse groups. When I look at our New Zealand Parliament today, well, you know, close to 40% women. Parity is within grasp. Many more Māori, Pacifica, Asian, you know, just a more diverse parliament. And that's been a good thing, and it's come with proportional representation. Second structural change is the issue of quotas or reserved seats. Now, where progress is slow, this is definitely worth looking at. Now, it always occasions a debate, and I remember, and I'm not sure whether Dame Carol is here yet, but I remember in 2010 going to Papua New Guinea as Administrator of UNDP, and Dame Carroll was the only woman Member of Parliament and the only woman Cabinet Minister. And Carroll had a bill for reserved seats. UNDP did a lot of work on that bill with Carroll. And my simple understanding of the bill is that in Papua New Guinea, the governors of the provinces have seats in the Parliament, and there's 22 of them. And so the proposal was that alongside each of these governors, there'd be a woman elected from each province. Give you 22 immediately, which was a sort of a quick solution, would have brought critical mass. Carroll could never get that bill implemented, but it's still a good idea, right? And of course, last time they went backwards. They had 3 women members, and now there's none. So I hope that started the debate again in Papua New Guinea. But they do work, these quotas, and I've seen them work around the world, and if nothing else is working, then it's worth trying. Another structural issue, my third one, is on campaign spending. There need to be limits that keep it relatively low, and they need to be enforced. And breaches need to be reported and investigated and people prosecuted. You have to send a clear message. This is very hard worldwide to enforce campaign limits. And the United States of America struggles with this. We struggle with New Zealand, but you have to give it your best shot, because money politics is what the survey here showed was such a significant disadvantage for women to break through. And here, as I say, it's not just the money politics for the campaign, it's also that the members of Parliament have these constituency funds which tend to skew things a bit. My personal opinion is that that's not a parliamentarian's business. I think parliamentarians should be holding governments to account for spending, not spending themselves. But that, again, is a longer-term structural issue and debate in the Solomon Islands. And my last point, so if we go through, it's the nature of the political system, it's whether you go for quotas or reserved seats, it's the enforcing limits on campaign spending, it's whether at some point you look at the Constituency Development Fund issues, and then there's the issue of political party development. I think this is a good development because it gets away from the kind of big man sort of syndrome in politics. If you can go to parties which are actually putting up, programs, ideas that people can rally around. So, in summary, yes, there are a lot of challenges for women breaking through here, but you are not alone and it can be done. Around the world, if we look at women's leadership, I gave the figure of just over 23% of the world's members of Parliament are women. For heads of government, like your PM, my PM, 5.7% are female in the world. This is pathetic. Barely more than 1 in 20. And for heads of state, which includes our Queen, that's 7.2%. So really, women globally, we've got some big, big hills to climb. But it can change, and it is really about stepping in, leaning in, stepping up, building the confidence, building the networks, building the alliances, finding the male champions. Because I go back 125 years ago, this funny little parliament at the furthest end of the earth in New Zealand, all male, voted for women to vote. So men must be champions and allies. UN Women has had this he for she campaign running for a while, and it's often used as bringing men on board to campaign against violence against women. But he for she could work in political representation as well, that men become champions of women's representation because it's the right thing to do, but it's a smart thing to do for Solomon Islands and for every country. And remember that every effort you make is going to build a platform for the future. Every extra woman elected is another woman who's there as a role model that the young ones are looking at and thinking, oh, maybe that one day that could be me. So really this workshop is very timely. There's not a moment to lose after it because the election is not far away. but I really hope that it helps build the confidence that this can be done. It's a big hill to climb, but it can be done. And all pulling together, you know, you come here as women with many different views and opinions. That's great, that's democracy. But what you're united in, and we hope the men also with us today are united in, is there should be more women in the Parliament and the provincial assemblies of Solomon Islands, and you're going to give it your big shot, your best shot to make that happen next time. Thank you.